Hello students, today we will talk about the transport of gases. Fine. Now we know that blood is the medium for the transport of oxygen as well as for the CO2. Fine. If we talk about the transport of oxygen, 97% oxygen is transported through RBCs and 3% oxygen is transported in the form of plasma. Fine. And the physiology of CO2 is more complex in comparison to O2. 70% of CO2 is transported in the form of bicarbonate ions. 20 to 25% CO2 is transported through RBCs and 7% CO2 is transported in dissolved form through plasma. Fine. In this lecture, we will talk about the transport of oxygen. Fine. Let's have a separate lecture for the transport of CO2. So what happens? RBCs contains red colored iron containing pigment which is known as hemoglobin. We know very well about the hemoglobin, है ना, बहुत छोटी क्लासेस से आप पढ़ते आए हो what is hemoglobin. Fine. Red colored iron containing pigment is hemoglobin. So this hemoglobin will bind with the oxygen molecule and a complex will be formed known as oxyhemoglobin. Oxy means oxygen and hemoglobin. And one molecule of hemoglobin can bind with the 4 molecules of oxygen. Means maximum hemoglobin 4 molecules of oxygen से bind कर सकता है. Suppose hemoglobin is a car and oxygen is passenger. So 4 passengers can accommodate inside this car, that is hemoglobin. हीमोग्लोबिन के पास जो सीट है वो कितनी है? 4. मतलब ये 4 पैसेंजर्स को अपने साथ लेकर जा सकता है. फाइन. इफ वी प्लॉट अ ग्राफ between the partial pressure of oxygen and the percentage saturation of hemoglobin, then we get a sigmoid curve like this. This curve is known as oxygen dissociation curve. Fine. Suppose the concentration or the partial pressure of oxygen is 20. Fine. This is the partial pressure of oxygen and this is the percentage saturation of hemoglobin. Fine. If 20% oxygen is there, then what happens? See, then only 1 molecule of oxygen will bind. Fine. If the concentration of CO2 is more, suppose 40 or 50%, then second molecule of O2 will bind, means 2 molecules are there. If the concentration will increase further, then what happens? 3 molecules will bind. And where the concentration of oxygen or the pressure of oxygen is highest, then hemoglobin is occupied by 4 oxygen molecules. मतलब अभी चारों की चारों साइड्स जो हीमोग्लोबिन की थी वो फिल हो चुकी हैं बाय पैसेंजर, दैट इज द oxygen. This point is called as the saturation level. मतलब इसके बाद अब कोई बाइंडिंग नहीं होगी. यहाँ पर जो ऑक्सीजन की कंसंट्रेशन है वो बहुत ही ज़्यादा है, तो हीमोग्लोबिन विल completely bind with all the 4 oxygen molecules. फाइन. अब जब भी कुछ अच्छा काम होने जाएगा ना तो कोई ना कोई उसको डिस्टर्ब करने आ ही जाएगा, है ना. कहने का मतलब ये कि ऐसे कौन से फैक्टर्स हैं जो इस कॉम्प्लेक्स फॉर्मेशन को फेवर करेंगे या उसके अगेंस्ट होंगे। फॉर एग्जाम्पल CO2, हीमोग्लोबिन ऑक्सीजन से वहाँ बाइंड करेगा जहाँ पर CO2 की कंसंट्रेशन बहुत कम होगी, और हमें पता है दैट द कंसंट्रेशन ऑफ CO2 इज वेरी हाई इन द टिश्यू. So hemoglobin will release oxygen in the tissue and then binds with the CO2. That means for binding of this complex, the concentration of CO2 must be less. Fine. And let me tell you, the affinity of hemoglobin is much higher for CO2 in comparison to O2. सो जब भी हीमोग्लोबिन को लगेगा कि यहाँ पर CO2 की कंसंट्रेशन ज़्यादा है तो ये उसी से बाइंड करेगा, ऑक्सीजन से नहीं करेगा. ओके, सो लो CO2 कंसंट्रेशन मस्ट बी देयर फॉर द फॉर्मेशन ऑफ दिस कॉम्प्लेक्स. सेकेंड इज द pH. You know very well about the pH scale. If the value is below 7, it is acidic character. Above 7, basic character. At 7 is neutral. Fine. अगर pH इंक्रीज होता है तो वो इस कॉम्प्लेक्स फॉर्मेशन को फेवर करता है, बिकॉज दिस pH इज डायरेक्टली रिलेटेड टू CO2. CO2 इज ट्रांसपोर्टेड इन द फॉर्म ऑफ कार्बोनिक एसिड. दैट मीन्स अगर pH आपका लो होगा तो एसिडिक कैरेक्टर बढ़ जाएगा. एसिडिक कैरेक्टर अगर बढ़ेगा तो ये बाइंडिंग जो है हमारी वो अफेक्ट हो जाएगी. फाइन. सो फॉर बाइंडिंग दिस कॉम्प्लेक्स, concentration of CO2 must be low and the pH must be high, or you can say the acidic character must be low. Temperature should be accurate, or you can say if the temperature is very much high, then this temperature will degrade this complex, because Hb is what? It is a protein and proteins are affected by high temperature. So low temperature will favor the formation of this complex. Fine. And the formation of this complex or this binding, you can say, is reversible process. Why it is reversible? Because we know that in the tissue the concentration of CO2 is very high, so hemoglobin will release oxygen in the tissue and will bind with the CO2. Then it move with the CO2. Again, if Hb finds the concentration of oxygen is high, then again it will release CO2 and binds with the oxygen. ये रिवर्सिबल प्रोसेस चलती ही रहती है. मतलब जहाँ पे कंसंट्रेशन O2 की ज़्यादा मिलेगी वहाँ पे O2 से बाइंड करेगा, और जहाँ पे कंसंट्रेशन CO2 की ज़्यादा मिलेगी वहाँ पे CO2 से बाइंड करेगा. बट स्टिल Hb हैज़ much more affinity for CO2 than O2. Fine. And 100 ml of oxygenated blood delivers 5 ml of oxygen. Fine. So this was all about the transport of oxygen. You have to remember this data, that 97% oxygen is transported through RBCs and 3% is transported in dissolved form through plasma. Oxygen will bind with the hemoglobin and will form oxyhemoglobin. 4 oxygen molecules will bind with the single hemoglobin, and oxygen and hemoglobin binding will takes place where the concentration or the partial pressure of CO2 is very low. And when we plot a graph between the partial pressure of O2 and the percentage saturation of hemoglobin, we will get S-shaped curve or a sigmoid curve. This is called as the oxygen dissociation curve, and the factors affecting this curve are CO2, pH and temperature. Temperature must be low, CO2 concentration must be low, and pH must be high for the formation of this complex. Fine. and 100 ml of oxygenated blood can transport 5 ml of oxygen.